My name is Nicholas Demoncho. I am a professor of architecture and urban design in the College of Environmental Design here at UC Berkeley, one of the co-sponsors for tonight's lecture. And I'm also the director of the Berkeley Center for New Media, also the host and sponsor for tonight's lecture. And I'll explain what's going on there. So I teach mostly architecture, but I think a lot in the context of Berkeley, of the Berkeley Center for New Media, about new media. And so you're here tonight in the Art, Technology, and Culture Colloquium of the Berkeley Center for New Media, to which I'm delighted to welcome you. I'm also delighted to welcome you to the larger series of which we are a part, which is Arts and Design Mondays, hosted arranged and organized by the Vice Chancellor for Arts and Design, Shannon Jackson, in her office, and we're particularly grateful to that office for paying for and subsidizing the opening of this marvelous theater on Monday nights, which allows us to be here with you. So with that said, I'll also welcome you to the first of three lectures co-sponsored by the BCNM's Art, Technology, and Culture Colloquium and the College of Environmental Design, happening over the course of this year. The first tonight is a presentation from Kim Stanley Robinson, who I'm about to introduce. The second in the spring is in February. We'll be joined by the Nigerian-American Afrofuturist author Nnedi Okorafor. And in April, we'll be joined, myself and Adam Savage will discuss the past and future of spacesuit design also on this stage. All of these three lectures are a part of a year-long project that I'm leading in the College of Environmental Design, along with my colleague Jeff Mena, visiting professor this year at Berkeley, on the theme, very close to the theme of tonight's lecture, of science fiction and the future of California. I'm going to show you a few slides just to introduce this larger series. Do I need to do something here to make them appear? Oh, here they are. Perfect. So, one of of course, I'm as I say, an architect, a professor of architecture and urban design. I think a lot about very serious issues like climate change and the future of cities and landscapes in California, how to make our communities more resilient, how to make them more equitable, how to create kinds of resilience that are not just ecological, but also social and economic as well. It is the proposition of this year-long exercise, in which I'm joined by a team of about a dozen graduate students, also present here tonight. It is the proposition that science fiction is not just an enjoyable escape against the future that we face here in California, but rather potentially an essential way to investigate it. It must here be said that science fiction is a uniquely Californian phenomenon. Imagine futures, imagine galaxies, are always actually California and represent the galaxy of identities and possibilities contained within it. Sometimes this is clear, and always, I would argue, it is just below the surface. In the visual tropes and spatial and infrastructural phenomena of California that follow us from the edge of the border and the edge of the continent to the edge between today and tomorrow. This is mostly likely the case, as Kim Stanley Robinson himself has observed, because California is already a science fictional place. The desert has been terraformed, he continues. The whole water system is unnatural and artificial. It doesn't look like it should look. The places of California exist most of all at the scale of landscape and technology, a conundrum that traditionally defeats normal architecture and even conventional urbanism. In this light, we might also observe that the precarious balance between landscape, nature, and technology of which this state is made is today in a state of great peril. Ecological and technological transformations threaten California's cities and landscapes as never before. Wildfires, sea level rise, and resulting groundwater flooding, adding to the omnipresent seismic hazards of the continental margin. If we had to invent someone to help us think about all of this, we could not do better than the author and Californian citizen, Kim Stanley Robinson. He has made his home in California since the age of 2, I believe. Currently a resident of Davis, California. If you were inventing someone to help us think about this, he would have indeed, as Kim Stanley Robinson did, done his PhD under the scholarship of the critic and Marxist scholar Frederick Jameson. He would be read deeply in the literary phenomena of science fiction itself, as we've observed, a uniquely Californian phenomena. He would have started, as Kim Stanley Robinson did, with a trilogy of novels about California and its future, before moving on to Mars and the rest of the solar system. He would have, as Kim Stanley Robinson has, spent time with the National Science Foundation at a research base in Antarctica. He would have been named a hero of the environment by Time magazine for his optimistic focus on the future. He would have spoken at conferences on rethinking capitalism, at the World Science Fiction Convention, and at other points and places around the globe, including, we're very fortunate, here tonight. He is most famous for extrapolating ruthlessly, thoughtfully, and sanguinely what the future of our ecologies and technologies mean, most of all here. I am particularly grateful to him for coming tonight and kicking off this series within a series within a series on science fiction, art, culture, technology, and the larger themes of citizenship, of which Berkeley is, of course, inherently dedicated. And I'm grateful to all of you tonight for coming. I'm grateful to Laura Wolf and Laura McPhee for helping this happen, for Massimo and the rest of his staff at the Arts and Design Initiative, and most of all, to Kim Stanley Robinson for joining us tonight. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Nicholas, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for coming. I want to thank also Jeff and Laura for helping coming here. So a talk about creating a good Anthropocene is actually kind of a swimming uphill project at this moment. Day after Brazil just elected someone dedicated to destroying the Amazon forest, etc., we don't want to go into the present moment too deeply, dig too deep a hole, because already I'm going to have to talk fast and get through a lot of topics. But the Anthropocene, got to talk about that first, is an exercise in periodization. And we need to talk about periodization a little bit. What does it mean, and what does it mean to say that we're in a period called the Anthropocene? And this is nice because, in fact, the periodization, as my old teacher Fred Jameson said, we can't not periodize. When we look back at the past, if it's not just to be a meaningless flux of experience or to be chopped off by numbers like the 18th century, the 19th century, the 20th century, effectively meaningless, we have to try to put meaning on the past to place ourselves in the present and give us a trajectory towards the future. So we periodize. It's a theory of history. Every system of periodization reveals a theory of history. So Chinese history has dynasties. You go from the Ming dynasty to the Qing dynasty, and periods are named after the emperors that ran them for a while. And so the Ming dynasty changing to the Qing dynasty, this is like 1640, world historians are troubled by the fact that it's exactly the same time that the English Revolution, that they chopped off the English king's head and replaced it briefly with the Puritan system under Cromwell. Well, why did those things happen on the same day? in the same year. Was there something going on in world history, or was this a complete coincidence? It's hard to answer that one, but you deeply fall into ways of periodizing when you begin to think this way. So up until recently, we weren't in the Anthropocene. We were in what you would call the postmodern period. So postmodernism is really kind of again, my teacher, Fred Jameson, is deeply involved in that naming, and what he would say is that it's really a Marxist thing. So that as in Marx, you start with antiquity and the sort of Asiatic empires, and then you move into feudalism, and then you move into capitalism, and then, speaking as a science fiction writer, Marx and Engels would say, you move into socialism and then to communism, a periodization system that speaks to the future. Jameson and others would have said that the capitalist period itself can be cut into periodizations. And for people coming from literature, like Jameson, like myself, you have a very nice split between realism, which it comes with the kind of domestic novel of the 19th century, realist painting. It's something that's kind of post-romantic, 19th century thing. The bourgeois revolution, that's realism. Then modernism. So that's impressionist painting and modern architecture. And again, picking the moment that the transition comes is very difficult. And then after modernism, postmodernism, because something seems to have changed between, say, 1973 and 1980 that cast us into a different period. And what Jameson claimed in his book on postmodernism was that this was sort of the superstructure imitating the base or following the base, that it was changes in the way capitalism itself was running, from 19th century individual nation-state capitalism to imperialism of the modern period to a shift, and sometimes even energy systems are involved in this, but a shift to the globalization of the neoliberal turn that gets us also postmodernism as a style. And crucially, I want to say that what Jameson claimed was that the modernist period, the period of modernism, was when the world was still not fully modernized, that there were new cities and there was old countryside existing together, the residual and the emergent sharply together in places like France, so that modernism was about that, about the coming of the modern, not, and then when the whole world is one global commodity structure and you go up into the mountains of Nepal, as I did in 1985, and the Nepali that was serving me in a tea hut had a Pink Floyd t-shirt on. At that point, you're in the postmodern period where the whole world is one same space. And so let's keep that in mind. That's one periodization scheme. Another one comes from Giovanni Arrighi, a political economist from Johns Hopkins, who said, look, capitalism has also a history that has to do with the hegemonic power and how much resources can be rallied to one power center. He claimed it began in Genoa in the Renaissance, or the early modern period, you might say. And then it moved to Holland as the next power center. And then it moved to Britain. And then it moved to the United States. And at the end of his life, Arrighi's life was cut short. He was postulating and wondering whether China might be the next hegemonic power after the United States, to be the center of a world capitalist state. But because capitalism depends on permanent growth in a finite system, Arrighi and others were wondering, does China actually have anywhere to grow compared to the United States, compared to Britain and Holland in the past? The Belt and Road program, the investments in Africa and in Latin America might indicate how China is trying to solve this conundrum of growth in an already full world. But and that remains a mystery to all of us. Now, then Jason Moores, in an important book called Capitalism in the Web of Life, he said that the periods are not so much periods as bubbles through history that revolve around what he called the four cheaps: cheap land, cheap people, cheap food, cheap energy. Those are the four cheaps. You get a sudden infusion of a cheap new resource, be it land by colonization and enslavement of the other peoples of the world, an infusion of cheap people by those very slaves. Or cheap food, like the sugar revolution, where suddenly there was refined sugar and gin. Or the green revolution of the 1960s, where suddenly the productivity of farms was nearly doubled in 10 years by the application of new techniques. That's cheap food. And cheap energy. He talks about cutting down forests, then digging up peat bogs, then finding coal beds, then discovering oil, and now natural gas being fracked out, that these are infusions of cheap energy. And what he claims in his book is there are no cheaps left. And I can tell you from my perspective as a Martian, space is never cheap. There's nothing that we can, that is not the next ring of expansion, okay? We are on this planet in multiple senses. So all of these periodization schemes come into a zone where suddenly the scientific community reported to the world, to the public of the world, that climate change had begun. No individual can notice climate change. This is a technological achievement of the scientific community by gathering data and analyzing data and running models. And that's how we discovered this, not by any one individual going, oh my God, it's hotter today, or this summer was hotter than last summer. Isn't how it works. And there are micro cases where some of us going to the Sierras these last 45 years will notice that the glaciers are half as big. Well, this is kind of a thermostat that sort of works, but really climate change was the scientific community. They raised their hand from the back of the room where they had been busily doing their work and somewhat disconnected from policy, and they said, give us the money to do our research. We'll choose the research topics. We'll give you the goods. We'll give you the necessities and the toys and the medicine, but don't mess with us. This was the post-war agreement between science and society. So at the back of the room, they raise their hand and say, uh-oh, the energy source that is powering the world is also destroying the biosphere. On went the machine. Nobody paid attention. And the scientific community, I think, was shocked by this. And what we see now is what I call the technocratic push of the scientific community saying, if they're not going to pay attention, we're actually going to have to get into politics. You get things like the Paris Accord, or here in California, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act of 2014. In myriad ways, there's a technocratic push to make us change by changing the laws. And so this is something to pay attention to as a thing in history right now. Part of that technocratic push was a scientist named Paul Crutzen, who had picked up a term from another scientist of the 80s. E.O. Wilson himself is a good historian of this word. In the Anthropocene, he said, we're in the Anthropocene. Humanity is a major driving force in the geological record, and the stratigraphers, if they examine it, are going to declare a new age. Instead of being in the Holocene, we're going to be in the Anthropocene. And this was an intervention, an attempted intervention, let's say. He said, look, we've got to make it clear ideologically, because all of these relationships are ideological, they're imaginary relationships to the real situation. We've got to make it clearer of what's going on here so that people will be able to take it a little more seriously. So when I say all these periodization schemes are theories of history, then therefore they're ideologies, and that science also has done one, the question comes up, does that mean science is an ideology? Well, the answer is yes, it is. It's an imaginary relationship to the real situation, but it's different. It's been accomplished by thousands of people. They have done trial and error. They've made observations. They've applied the scientific method to not only the world, but to the scientific method itself, trying to make it better, sharper, more responsive to reality. They've argued with each other. They've black boxed a certain number of facts. The periodic table, the planetary orbits. These are in black boxes that you no longer have to argue about because they've been established by a big enough community and a big enough data set with enough analysis that we can agree that this is what's going on in reality. That's different than Fred Jameson, Giovanni Arrighi, and Jason Moore saying, well, the periods belong to this reason for that reason. Because when you get into human history, the multivariant aspect of it, that you cannot destrand, means that you can't really say why or how periods have changed. But the scientists will say, look, in the past, we know that there have been 5 mass extinction events in Earth's geological history, and we're about to kick off the 6th one. And if we don't change our ways, the Anthropocene will be marked by a mass extinction event, the last one being the dinosaurs at 65 million years ago, the big one being the Permian about 250 million years ago. Well, talk about imagination, to get that kind of relationship to the rocks on the ground, to the way that they're radiating invisibly, to have made that history of the past by such indirect means is very imaginative indeed. So yeah, Science is an ideology. And you can even imagine that this whole thing about the Anthropocene is effectively a science fiction story. What they're saying is that 25 million years from now, if there are future species evolved from us, or if there's aliens that come by the Earth, any millions of years from now, you look back to this moment, and in the geological record, the rocks themselves, you'll see that something happened. Now, they argue already, because the moment that the word Anthropocene was suggested to the world, people began to argue about when it might have started. Well, the atomic bombs being blown up in the late 40s and early 50s, that leaves a record that will persist for a long time, that radiation spike, and those particular kinds of radiation. And then some people say, but wait a second, when Europeans landed in the New World in 1492, all the Native Americans died from Old World diseases, and they were keeping the forests under control, and the whole New World was a garden, it was meadows, and the forest came back, and there was an uptake of carbon dioxide, and they can see it in the fossil record, in the air bubbles that were in Greenland. They can see that there's a gigantic drop in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in the 16th century. Well, maybe that's something they'll see 25 million years from now. But here's what I'm going to claim. 25 million years from now, they can look back to our time and say, well, between Ice Age number 58 and Ice Age number 59, there's a bunch of weird stuff. Maybe an asteroid crashed in with a particular metal load. Maybe an alien starship accidentally speared the Earth and scattered its stuff. I mean, they won't even know what happened unless there's a mass extinction event. And it hasn't happened yet, the mass extinction event. So therefore, the name the Anthropocene is provisional and proleptic, they'll call it in literary criticism, which is to say it's in the future tense. If we keep going how we're going, if we cause the sixth great mass extinction event in Earth's history, then looking back from that 25 million years in the future, they will see a mark in our time. They'll see the mass extinction. But if we run a good Anthropocene and we don't cause a mass extinction event in the next couple hundred years and correct our relationship to the biosphere, then it could be that the Anthropocene could, in effect, by the American Geophysical Union or by culture at large, be canceled. Like, oh, well, it didn't happen, so we're still in the Holocene. But what that would mean is, really, that we would have started a good Anthropocene rather than a bad one. And so that's what I want to talk about more today. Good Anthropocene comes down in many ways to humans' interaction with the biosphere, and what Nature magazine, in just this week's issue of Nature magazine, which, believe me, none of us can read all of because it's ridiculously long and it comes weekly. It's highly technical. But they talk about planetary boundaries framework. But we used to call that carrying capacity. And this is an interesting question. So we're at something like 7.5 billion, and the UN demographers in a science fiction story of their own say that if things go on, which is always a big if, and it is a science fiction story, and we'll get to 10 or 11 billion, is that too many people for the Earth to support? We can't answer that question. So this is one of the reasons why carrying capacity as such can't be used to talk about the good Anthropocene. There's a very useful book on this topic, and I love its title. It's called How Many People Can the Earth Support? So it's easy to remember. Joel Cohen. And his answer is, we don't know, because humans are not like deer on the island in the Great Lakes where the whole idea of carrying capacity came about. If everybody were like deer and ate the same thing, consumed the same amounts, the ecologists could run some equations and they could give the Earth a carrying capacity. But because people like us consume 30 times more of the Earth's resources than the people who are farming in India using effectively feudal technology or insufficient technology, let's say, subsistence farmers, we're using 30 times more energy than them. So when you say how many people can the Earth support, which lifestyle are you talking about? So I've read estimates for the carrying capacity of humans on this planet from 100 million to 12 trillion. What? That's right. The 100 million, those are deep ecologists who regard humanity as a kind of a plague that the Earth is unfortunately suffering. Okay, so yeah, it's at the 12 trillion, and I have to proudly admit that the article that proposed that carrying capacity Earth was 12 trillion was published in Analog magazine. So it comes out of my community, but it was a British planetary scientist who published this article, and apparently I looked into it a little bit and got it explained to me by more scientifically literate friends, and they explained that the amount of sunlight hitting the Earth, if it was translated directly with no losses of transmission into human calories, would keep 12 trillion people alive. So there's a lot of sunlight. That's the conclusion. And the realistic images, estimates, as Joel Cohen points out in his book, they range from about 2 billion to about 30 billion. And these are less imaginative relationships to the real situation. There's some equations, there's some argumentation that makes sense, etc. But that's too big of a number to help us much. So if it's 2 billion, we're in terrible trouble. If it's 30 billion, then we are still within a safe margin. So that's why the name of that science has kind of changed to planetary boundaries frameworks. This scientific paper is looking at agriculture. Can we grow enough food sustainably over the long haul to feed 7.5 billion? And it's got a lot of charts and graphs. It has the potential to become one of the famous Nature papers, because every once in a while Nature will publish a paper that gets discussed for years afterwards. The Robert Constanza paper from, I think, 1997 calculated how much does the natural world provide humanity in goods and services every year if you were to put a dollar amount on it, if you had to pay for it all. And they concluded that it would be $33 trillion a year in 1997 dollars. Well, many people had to raise their hand and point out that without the Earth's goods and services, we'd all be dead. So is it really just $33 trillion? Is it not infinity? Are there not some things that are effectively priceless for life? And so it is a controversial paper, but it hasn't been forgotten. It's part of the argument. And this new one about planetary frameworks, which you can look up, may have the ability to rally the discussion around what agriculture is and what it can be and what it has to be. So what would a good Anthropocene look like? I want to say first, it would mean no extinction event, no mass extinction event. The project, if it was guided towards avoiding a mass extinction event, this would be like the organizing principle for activities that would be good for everything. So that's my first definition of a good Anthropocene, no mass extinction event. And then let's take it, this of course is talking about all the other species that we're endangering and killing off. For ourselves, I say it would mean food, water, shelter, clothing, healthcare, education, and work for everybody on the planet. And so it's a little uninspiring to talk about adequacy for all, but I can't think of a better word. Adequacy for everybody, all the humans on the planet. That would be a benchmark for me, below which you don't have a good Anthropocene. And then all the other mammals doing well, including the wild ones. 97% of the meat on the planet right now is us and our domestic beasts. So wild animals, by which I mean flesh and blood, the creatures, essentially the animal kingdom is now, wild animals are 3% of the biomass on the planet that is in the meat form. Well, this is a danger signal to the mass extinction event and a sign of our plague-like nature, like the great auctionization event of 400 million years ago, when suddenly little creatures that pumped that oxygen as a byproduct out into the atmosphere changed everything. And in fact, we're breathing that oxygen now. We are in that category, perhaps, if we continue along this path. But to get into balanced flows with the biosphere, where all the other mammals and birds and fish and amphibians and plants were all doing well, would be a very sophisticated technological achievement indeed. And we are the technological species, Homo faber. We were technological before we were even human, in that the pre-Homo sapiens species in Africa had both tools and fire. So they were tool users, and it was in a coevolution with our tools that we became the human beings that we are. Couldn't occupy the cold regions until we had bone needles in order to sew up the furs to put on ourselves, to wear warm clothing, and then suddenly, boom, we're 20 degrees of latitude further north than we ever had been before. We are a technological species, and if we get into a good balance with the environment, it will be a technological achievement. And I'm going to say, for this carrying capacity problem, that just say 10 billion people. It's a round number. It's not like we can even imagine 1 million people in our heads. So why not pick a number that's a round number? And also the UN saying we might get there just from what they call the demographic surge. But let's say that this good condition of the people and planet biosphere together can exist even with 10 billion humans, and see what we have to do to get to that. How do we get from here, which is a very messed up world, to there? And we have to do it fast, because every year that we don't do it, it gets harder to do it. And indeed, when you get the mass extinction event, there's no repairing that. As much as I love the de-extinction crowd, and I hope we get mammoths back, that would be cool, you cannot de-extinct from a mass extinction event. So you don't want to have that fantasy that there's some kind of restitution of the bad situation. We have to solve it first. Well, before I get into this topic of terraforming, let's talk about terraforming in different new ways. I'm going to suggest all these things are terraforming. The so-called Green New Deal, that 1.5 to 2% of every country's GDP gets devoted to swapping out from dirty energy to clean energy, from fossil fuel burning to solar, wind, tide, wave power. That the calculations have been made by people, and again, this is an imaginary relationship to the real situation. I can't speak to it myself, but the claim has been made that much money spent every year will get it done fast enough. We'll get it done in 20 years. And it's part of the group that has been trying to support the Paris Accord that worked out these figures. So if you Google Green New Deal, you'll run into this. And this is very much of a conservative Keynesian, I mean to say it's not a neoliberal move, because the neoliberal move is just to destroy the earth and have fun while you can. That's neoliberalism and austerity. But if you take one step back to Keynesianism, then this is just a Keynesian move. The government primes the pump when necessary to save the economy, and in this case, to save the ecology as well, the Green New Deal. So let's keep that in mind. And then, changing agriculture. This Nature paper just makes it really clear. A lot of the Earth's surface is given over to agriculture, and by agriculture, let's include forestry and ranching. And with those three projects, which are human projects, you have a situation that needs very badly, essentially, a second green revolution. The first green revolution, which was to a very surprising degree invented at UC Davis, my hometown and a university that I visit a lot. And it's the great ag school, along with Cornell, in the United States and in the world. And everybody around the world will recognize UC Davis, even, dare I say it, before UC Berkeley, because they've all gone to farm school there and gone back to their country to do farming. And farming is important. And the Green Revolution doubled or tripled food yields, but at a cost to the environment, because it was fossil fuel driven, and it was pesticide driven, and it was nitrogen driven, and it only used hybridization. It didn't use genetic engineering in terms of changing the plants, but hybridization is strong enough. Indeed, genetic engineering is just hybridization with tiny, tiny scissors. So I wouldn't be too freaked out about genetic engineering, since we've been doing it since the Paleolithic times. In any case, we need a second green revolution, which would involve what they call regenerative agriculture. It would have to include genetic engineering and organic farming techniques in the same package. It would have to bring carbon back into the soil rather than pushing carbon out into the atmosphere. And so these things are being worked out, and they are crucial. And so changing agriculture when you say geoengineering, you don't think to yourself, oh yeah, we've got to change agriculture. That would be a massive geoengineering hit. But it is one. It really is. And then social justice. Well, I mean, I'm just as flag-waving of a hippie as any hippie here, and God bless the cause. Social justice is, in fact, an incredibly powerful geoengineering tool. And it comes down mostly to women's rights. So the crash of our biosphere is not just capitalism, it's also patriarchy. Because all the work gets put on women that doesn't get paid for. And also, when they don't have legal rights and the freedom of movement, property, education, and everything else, then the population soars. When women have those things, then the population begins to actually drop. The replacement rate is 2.2 kids per woman. And I always like to think of that 0.2 of a kid. I'm thinking, that's me, man. I'm that 0.2 of a kid. But that's the replacement rate. And in countries where women have their full rights, they are, in fact, so busy that the population rate goes down to 1.8 per woman, 1.5 per woman. There isn't time. There isn't social reproduction still dropped on them like a cannonball. And there just isn't enough hours in a day to have 5, 6, or 7 kids, which is kind of a feudal thing in patriarchy, where the women and the children are treated like domestic beasts to help keep the farm farmed. It's an old-style thing. It's a residual from an earlier moment. And the faster it goes, the better. So social justice in general is important. Of course, women's rights, but then also poverty reduction. It turns out that the biggest hammering on the environment is the poorest people and the richest people. So the poorest people, because of topsoil loss and forestry loss, if you've got to get a meal on the fire that night in order not to starve, you are going to cut down the local forests, and you do. And topsoil gets run away by using agricultural practices that are essentially acts of desperation to stay alive. So the poorest people. And then with the wealthy, it's just conspicuous consumption, burning way more energy than you have to get to be happy. So social justice is a very important geoengineering tool. And I would like to just point out that the UN Millennial Goals that were set in 2000, let's reduce poverty by, I forget the number of humans, and they did it. 15 years later, by their rubrics, they said, geez, we've taken the bottom 1% of the human population out of immiseration and out of poverty and brought them up to the poverty line or better. And let's accept that. That's a real finding. But it wasn't done as a capitalist act. It was not for profit. The world economy that we live in did not pay for that. It was the gift economy. A bit of the surplus was taken and poured into doing it. And what it proves, what the UN Millennium Project proves, is if that was the project for all of civilization, we could indeed get rid of all of the immiseration on this planet, the 2 billion out of the 7 billion people on this planet who are without adequate food, toilets, water, and to a certain extent, shelter. But those 3 are enough for full-on immiseration. And that's 2 out of every 7 person on the planet. Should that be changed? Yes. Could we change it? Yes. Are we changing it? No, because we live in the global capitalist system that says profit, quarterly profit, shareholder value are the 2 ways that you measure whether you're doing good or not. And so it's not profitable to do poverty reduction, not at all. It's a cost. But what does that mean at this point? Cost, price, value. They get very confused. Another geoengineering project is just making space for the wild creatures, restoring habitat, landscape restoration, rewilding. There's various names for this. The Central Valley of California is an area I live in, and I've been studying it for a long time. It's simply an industrial floor. It's the floor of a factory that is 400 miles long and 100 miles wide. It's treated like a factory. Everything's efficient. Nothing's alive. The valley floor is dead of the wild creatures that used to live there, except for some rabbits and some snakes. And there's a fair number of birds left. But the Serengeti of North America that it was before Europeans arrived, that's completely gone. And I can tell you that from my own personal witnessing. It doesn't have to be that way. You could restore the oak trees. That's something the California Native Plant Society loves, the idea. Restore the oak trees of California, all the ring around the Central Valley and the Central Valley itself. Re-oaking is good for carbon drawdown. It's good for the landscape in multiple ways, and it kind of rewilds it because there's more habitat for wild creatures. And if given even the slightest room, wild creatures will come back and live their lives. They're very good at it. So then carbon drawdown as part of agriculture, as part of forestry, and even as a part of ranching, although that's much more controversial, it'd be better, well, just to not have cows anymore and to do the ranching be done for buffalo, be done for woolly mammoths, be done for wolves and grizzly bears, that this is what the ranches should be for. And I don't know what the carbon drawdown would be because nobody knows. But that's certainly something that would be geoengineering. So let me shift to geoengineering as we usually are thinking of it now. The main one is certainly solar radiation management, by which they mean you imitate a volcanic explosion. You pump up like a Pinatubo's worth of dust into the atmosphere. It's not very expensive. It's not hard technologically. And then for about 5 years, you have reduced temperatures. And there's a lot of controversy about this idea. There's opinions, people throw opinions out about this, and that are basically a reflexive knee-jerk response at like, oh my God, let's not try to do something that crazy. We've already, of course, changed the atmosphere by adding a ton of CO2. But to do it on purpose, that would be crazy. So there's a kind of the Frankenstein response. There are some things that man was not meant to know that exists in all of us, and especially amongst California leftists, to say, oh my God, that's a techno-silver bullet response. That's a Silicon Valley response. I hate that response. It's bound to backfire. The monsoon won't work, or we'll go into a snowpiercer situation, blah, 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 blah. All of that is, of course, speculative until we actually do it. And I tried to write an essay for the Sierra Club saying, it might be a good idea in certain situations, and I was actually censored. Oh, you can't say that in the Sierra Club magazine. We have an official position against solar radiation management. Saying, whoa, really? And so I pushed it through. Anyway, as a what if. Because here's the thing. There could be a heat wave in the next 5 to 10 years, a heat wave that could kill 100 million people at a shot. There was a heat wave in Europe a couple of years ago. It killed 70,000 people. But of course, 70,000 amongst 500 million, and they're scattered through about 30 countries, and it's reported 6 months later, and nobody gets it except for the people next door to the person that died. That wasn't noticed. But if somewhere in the subcontinent of Asia, somewhere in Latin America, somewhere in Africa, if a heat stroke hits where the temperatures rise above about 135 degrees, then the human body can't take it, and everybody there will die, because the air conditioning won't work, electricity will go out, and boom. At that point, that nation, and this is my dystopian moment for you, or my science fictional moment, and my feeling is that a nation is going to do the solar radiation management and going to say to the rest of the world, sorry, you're the ones that torch the world, we're the ones trying to react to it, and we will have no moral basis to be objecting to solar radiation management at that point. And the volcano eruption that is imitated will allow the dust stays in the atmosphere for 5 years, it falls into the ocean, it falls down onto the land. You're back at the start-over point. Some people complain about that and say, well, it's just a 5-year solution. But on the other hand, if you're thinking it might be bad, if you're going to run an experiment that is over in 5 years and then you can evaluate the results, maybe it's a good thing that it comes and it goes. And I would just say to all of you, get ready for it, especially the young people here. You're likely to be seeing that happening, at which point you're going to be in an awkward situation if you think that it's just a terrible idea automatically. Because it's really the Western world that will have caused the necessity for it in the first place. The other geoengineering idea that is truly a geoengineering idea, although it's very local in its impacts, I want to bring up because I thought of it as a science fiction joke about 15 years ago, and now it's looking like maybe it won't be a joke. The Potsdam Institute in Germany has now studied it as a serious proposition, which when I saw that, it blew my mind. Which is this, sea level rise. James Hansen, his paper of 2016, the possibility for major sea level rise is really on the horizon. We've already raised the temperature of the Earth, the global average, by about 1 degree Celsius. That has been enough in Earth's past to raise sea level by 10 meters, 33 feet. Whoa. The mechanism is obscure. Whether it even happened or not is another one of these imaginative relationships to the real situation. 128,000 years ago, the Earth's surface was in such different positions that saying how much sea level rose then and how fast are both almost impossible paleological questions, paleoclimate, geology questions. Hard to say for sure, but if it's at all true, then we may be headed for major sea level rise. I looked it up, and right here in this theater, we are 335 feet above sea level. We're okay. But if you're only 20 feet above sea level, and a lot of the human population and a lot of the beaches of the world, like all of the beaches, and by definition, right? And a lot of the infrastructure of the seaports of the world are all going to be wrecked by massive sea level rise. So as the century goes on, and if the sea level begins to rise quickly, they are going to talk about, in that future time, pumping seawater onto the ice cap of eastern Antarctica. You pump it up there, it freezes up there. You do have a problem about 5,000 years later. That's their problem, okay? For us, you do it, and you've maybe saved all the sea levels of the world, and for those of us who love the beaches, all the beaches of the world. And so between the ocean-hugging cities as such, maybe the nation states that have extensive coastlines, which are most of them, the reinsurance companies, for sure, because they are the ones at the short end of the stick when it comes to insurance costs, they all would pay, and maybe a Silicon Valley billionaire will get inspired, and this billionaire, instead of going to Mars or anywhere else, the moon, there's a lot of fanciful plans out there in the billionaire community, but what if you just put one oil pipeline from the coast of Antarctica up to the ice cap? You'd have to keep it warm, but the Alaska oil pipeline, they have to keep warm. The technology already exists. You would need, the Potsdam Institute said, something like 10 million windmills, or the equivalent in solar panels. You'd need about 10,000 pipelines. And they calculated it would take 7% of all the electricity that humanity creates right now to pump that much water that high. It's 10,000 feet high. I was blown away. 7% of all the energy, it was in the gigawatts. It was amazing. And the Potsdam Institute, this is about a 3 or 4 year old study, said, well, that means it'll never be done. It's just simply too expensive. But then just recently I read that 1/4% of all the electricity created by human beings is being devoted to the creation of bitcoins. And I thought to myself, whoa, if you can spend that much energy on a speculative bubble of dubious intelligence, couldn't 30 times as much money as Bitcoin cost could save all the coastlines of the world? It doesn't sound as expensive at that point, and it may indeed happen. So I think all of these things are going to happen. All of these good efforts to create a good Anthropocene, they're all going to have to be thrown into the mix together, because there's no one silver bullet that's good enough to do the trick. It's going to be a combined project of all these things put together. And the question becomes, of course, how do we pay for that? This is the economist's question. And the conclusion often from mainstream neoliberal capitalist economists is, well, we can't pay for that. It's too expensive. It's not going to happen. So this is the famous Zizek or Jameson phrase, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism. Well, I'm thinking maybe we have to imagine a little harder, or maybe what's really hard to imagine is not the end of capitalism, but how we make that happen. So I think that we need to focus on what we used to call the nonprofit world. We need to think about public utility districts. We need to think about the commons as a working, regulated space within which people operate, like the Maine lobster fishery, like the Central Valley groundwater is going to become. The commons is a way that you have a limited resource and a certain number of people, and they use the resource without creating the tragedy of the commons. They use the commons by the way that the commons used to be regulated. We only take as much as is possible within sustainability of the system. And then Keynesianism. You just give government the power. Since governments and laws set the economy anyway, you just jigger the economy by way of passing different laws that press different buttons and make prices closer to costs. And I don't want to go into detail on this because it takes me an hour to explain what I mean even to myself, much less to other people. But it's all out there that if prices are all systemically too low and we're pushing the costs of what we do onto future generations, if we pay the full costs, then we'll stop doing as many wasteful things as we do. So that involves kind of taxes and incentives, and it involves us paying ourselves for doing the right things. So if you were to draw carbon down onto your farm as well as make food, then you should be getting, in fact, a break on your taxes or an incentive subsidy or a credit or a payment in a different currency, so that I don't know. This is where I don't want to get into the detail of it because it's so complicated. What is money? What is value? These turn out to be rabbit holes down which you can fall and talk all night without coming to a decent conclusion. But I will say that Thomas Piketty, when he talked about taxes, sharply progressive taxes, not just on individual incomes, which can be hidden, but on corporate assets, which can't be hidden. Sharply progressive taxes. That makes companies smaller to avoid the bigger tax hit, and it means that true costs are being paid, and it means that the government has the money to do good things. So then you get universal health care. You get college education for free because suddenly the government has a surplus rather than being indebted to private finance. And taxes are not controversial. Taxes have always existed. In fact, that's sort of the beginning of money. David Graeber says it isn't that money was created so that we could barter disparate things with each other. Money was created so that the owner could have the person on the farm in debt. So it was a number created to measure your debt, not to barter with. And the archaeologists are beginning to find in the records of Assyria that that's probably the true origins of money. So Piketty taxes and given to public works. Universal basic income, this is a great idea, especially as the experiments have shown. You give it to the women of this world rather than to the men, and you build stronger households and stronger ecologies. So, but universal basic income is just one part of a larger project of paying ourselves for doing the right thing rather than the wrong thing, so that you do get payment from the government, which is, of course, of the people, by the people, for the people, right? That is the plan. That's the performative act that we have to still perform, if we can. Then all of these become things that we do to try to create a situation where doing the right thing for the long haul of the survivability of the whole biosphere becomes also the economic thing to do. So economics has to be brought into coherence with the ecological necessities or the planetary boundary framework, as Nature magazine scientists like to call it. So this is a possible project. And in closing, I'd just like to say that it's not just a possible project, but a necessary project. So it's going to have to be done, and the sooner we get to it, the easier it becomes. And it is going to take a while. So this is another thing, is you can't get discouraged by this year, or the defeats of this last political cycle, or even by the next 5 years. The IPCC says we got 20 years. Well, that's intensely fast, and many of you will be alive to see that. But it's not inhumanly fast. Every year, laws are changed. Every year, elections happen. And if it's a century project, and none of us will be alive to see the end of it, that's the way it goes. That's the story of civilization. That's like building a cathedral or keeping a civilization going. There's no reason why we should be expected to win it in our lifetimes. It's not that kind of a situation. So buckle down for the long haul and be content. There's a green-red alliance. What I would say, and especially in Berkeley, it's important. The left has always been about social justice for people. That's the red project. The environmentalists have always been for the health of the biosphere. That's the green project. They've fought like cats and dogs for the entire history of those two movements, which is sad for those of us who consider ourselves to be matter alizarin, which is the color that you get when you mix green and red. You get brown, okay? A certain beautiful, brilliant, glossy brown. When those two are understood to be the same project, then you get a unification, you get a broad front, you get a united front, and you get progress created in that way, and that will be the Anthropocene. Thank you.
We'll have time for a couple of questions. I'll be joined by my colleague Jeff Mena on stage. Some of you have already contributed questions. If you have a question that you wrote down, please raise your hand and an usher will come get it from you.
46 minutes.
Well done.
Thank you. I was asked to do 45, and I always try to hit my mark.
So I will introduce my colleague, also Jeff Mena, visiting professor here, who is the author of the well-known architecture and design website Building Blog, as well as a Burglar's Guide to the City. We're very happy to have him with us. Jeff, do you want to start us off with a question?
Sure. First of all, is this, yeah, okay, this is working. I've been very surprised and impressed by Stan's stamina this afternoon. We put him through 4 hours of architectural midterms immediately prior to this lecture. So he's roaring on all cylinders here. I only wanted to just ask a couple questions, actually, just to kind of kick things off and take the kind of ceremonial first pitch, so to speak. But I guess I'm just curious about what it means to tell stories in this world of the Anthropocene. It's interesting that so many of the scenarios that as recently as 10 years ago, let alone 100 years ago, that would have been taken as extreme science fiction, based on climatic events or things like sea level rise and drowned cities and hurricanes, for that matter, in hitting Southern California. I guess I'm just curious about what role fiction, especially science fiction, can play in terms of telling stories in a world transformed so much that it appears to be science fictional. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I believe in it. It's been my work, but this is sort of like the carpenter talking about every problem is like a nail you can hit with a hammer. I mean, stories are important, yes, but I would like to emphasize that we are all science fiction writers for our own life. Any story set in the future is a science fiction story. So you have the utopian story. If I go to the university, then I'll get a good job, then I might meet a partner, and then I'll have a good life. The utopian science fiction story that you then act on in the present. And the dystopian science fiction story, it's somewhere between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. and you wake up and you're thinking, oh my God, I've probably got a deadly disease and I'm going to flunk out, and the dystopian science fiction story of how things could go wrong. So since everybody does it, when you read a science fiction story, you're saying, well, I know these operations from my own life, and this has been applied to the society by a storyteller that's given it a thick texture. That's what I think the novel is about, is giving us a kind of telepathic experience and a kind of a teleportation experience. You get to experience other people's thinking and in other times and places, and that's powerful in its own way. So between the personal science fiction writing that everybody does and the power of the novel to give you telepathy and teleportation, I think it's a good combination.
Sure. And then I was interested just listening to you give the lecture. It was exciting because in some ways I could imagine, if we could have been a fly on the wall while you were writing some of your trilogies or outlining many of the worlds that you've imagined, the level of detail and the level of thinking through the side effects, the epiphenomena of major changes, was like watching a science fiction thinker at work. And you mentioned the technocratic push, and I guess I'm just curious if you could imagine something like a world builder's push, where people who think in terms of world building on the level of a science fiction writer, really going to all of the specific details of what would happen if we colonized Mars, what would happen if we had a good Anthropocene. Is that level of imagination, or is that clarity of narrative vision important in politics? And could you imagine instead of Devin Nunes, a world builder, getting into Congress and bringing that kind of narrative power to governance?
I don't know, because it seems like the bumper sticker, the elevator pitch, the slogan, those need to be powerful too. So novels give you thick texture and they give you telepathy and teleportation, but it's always fiction. And so in the world of politics, what you would want is a project, and a project that you could understand and convey to other people, or you can understand yourself because reality is so confusing. I think it gets really tricky. I think that they are somewhat different projects, storytelling at different levels, ideology at different levels of how much bite they have, if you believe in them or not. So I wouldn't necessarily say that if only the politicians would read utopian science fiction, they'd be better politicians. I'm not sure that's true. There's cultural diffusion. There's mediation. So there's mediatory levels between the novel and the laws that have to do with everybody and a social imaginary that we all act on together. The assumptions that we make that we all agree must be true, or 51% of us agree must be true in case it comes down to a voting situation, etc.
So you guys have so many wonderful questions. I hate to disappoint you now, but we are not going to be able to get through all 45 of them that have already been
oh, come on, let's do it.
Yeah, but I'm going to, you deserve a drink at some point, that I have to say. But we will try and synthesize as many of them as we can.
And I'm going to be brief with my answers, or briefer.
Right. There, I think that there is a question which I think is a great follow-up to the previous question, which is if politicians shouldn't be reading science fiction, what nevertheless can science fiction do?
What I think if people read enough science fiction, they have a sense of the future as a possibility space, and then the present actions begin to lead towards one part of the possibility space or another, and there's kind of a rough consensus future that all the science fiction that you've ever read gives you the impression that we're headed towards that. And sometimes I like to hammer on that. Science fiction says humanity is going to go to the stars, and if we don't, we failed. I think that's a wrong story, factually impossible. So I hammer at that story. And then the other, but if you read a story that says if we were only to do everything right, we could live on a sustainable planet, well, I think that's a story that needs to be told. So,
on that score, then, here's another good one, which is that is there such a thing as a kinda okay Anthropocene? Which is to say,
that's a good question. That is a good question.
Yeah.
No, I get it, and I will argue that no. We are on an attenuating peninsula. We need a physical image here where we're on an attenuating peninsula that's steep on both sides. And if we tilt down towards the bad Anthropocene, the slippery slope falls off a cliff into disaster. And I haven't bothered to describe the bad Anthropocene in detail because we can all imagine it, but it's bad. If we start to make a better world, then the positive reinforcements for young people taking that as normal will mean that we'll slide down perhaps at a less steep angle, perhaps a bumpier road, into a good Anthropocene, but the midline disappears. That's what I'm claiming. It's an Aristotelian either or. We either make a good Anthropocene or we've got a really bad one.
Were there any scientific assumptions that you made previously, maybe analogous to the set of to your reliance on scientific research in what you spoke to us tonight about, that haven't passed the test of time and got superseded by later research?
Yeah, that's happened to me a lot. I'm an English major, and I got my degree in English from UCSD in 1974 and a PhD in 1982, so I'm way off the cutting edge. So I have these instinctive reactions, and one of them that I would just say is I thought, well, AI, big deal. It's like the cash register that I used to run at Orpheus Books and Davis. It's a calculator. It's never going to do anything interesting. Well, I totally don't believe that anymore. I think I was wrong. I think if they get quantum computers, if the programming gets clever enough, these things that computers can do now better than humans, like playing Go and playing chess, those are very restricted games. And life is not a restricted game. It doesn't have the same set of rules. You can't figure it out the same way. You can't run an algorithm for life. But what's interesting as a science fiction writer to contemplate is how AI, if pushed in various ways, could become a quite stupendously powerful tool. And also, the Turing test is a really low bar. We already believe in the sentience of our Siri and on our Alexis and all that. And, your talking door, like in Philip K. Dick's Ubik. As soon as somebody makes human-type sentences at you, you're assuming there's a consciousness behind it, a human. So I would say that we are going to have AIs that are stupendously interesting and possibly useful, and I didn't used to think that.
Question, a couple of people actually ask just along the lines of this question, nuclear power question mark.
Yeah.
We are in a nuclear-free zone here in Berkeley, but nevertheless.
No, my answer is exactly that. Nuclear power ? Because I think we need to do anything to decarbonize and to make sure that we don't pump up the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere above about 410 parts per million. In other words, we're in terrible trouble. If nuclear power was a carbon savings, and one more generation or a bridge technology, or if nuclear power was run by the US Navy, who is, although they've lost an atomic bomb or two, they've never had a nuclear power accident, and they have all these little nuclear power plants on their ships, which is absurd. And so in other words, if it was run non-for-profit by the US Navy and it saved us carbon, and you could also get rid of the nuclear waste by reducing it down to something and shooting it into space, if. But I've never read a study that has convinced me either way in its detail. And as an English major, I therefore would say, don't put anything off the table if it's going to decarbonize. But also, nuclear power is so weird, so dangerous, that there's probably better ways, since solar power is kicking its ass right now. So why go there if you've got a really good power source that's much, much safer?
Solar power is nuclear power, but the reactor is much further away.
Yes. Yes, yeah.
Good way to look at it.
Yeah. So here's a question. Just can you define terraforming after all that?
Well, again, a big question mark. Does my definition matter compared to the common definition? Well, no, my definition doesn't matter, because language is meant to communicate between people. So a new word comes up, and then by the way we use it with each other, it gets its definition. So what terraforming seems to mean right now is doing big, stupid things to save our ass that are possibly dangerous and are like a techno bullet, silver bullet, single solution, and it's not going to work, and we got to do better things. That's what terraforming seems to have its connotation cloud. Maybe I hang out with too many hippie leftists, but that's the connotation cloud I get from terraforming. Most people don't like it and are terrified by the idea of terraforming. If you reduce it to social justice and regenerative agriculture, and that's also terraforming, then, wait, I've been talking about geoengineering the whole time. Sorry, this comes from this afternoon. If you said geoengineering, then everything I just said was true. If you say terraforming, it means going to a planet that doesn't have an Earth-like set of atmosphere and plants and giving it that. It's like Mars or a planet somewhere else. You terraform it, you turn it into, boom, a place where humans can live. I think it's a great plan for Mars, and in the year 5000, I'll be advocating it. For right now, it's geoengineering, the terraforming of Earth that I was talking about as a word that we use in this weird way. Sorry.
Great. Also, as an attempt to synthesize, there's a lot of questions about the Red Mars universe and the Red Mars Trilogy, which obviously has struck a chord with many people over the last decades. And the questions range from everything from what is your favorite character from the Red Mars universe, to also much more perhaps difficult to imagine question like, how could we make something like the environmental court actually exist here on Earth? And so maybe I could just draw you out more generally on the relationship between Red Mars as likely a touchstone for a lot of people in this room, and the larger themes of your lecture tonight, as well as your favorite character.
Sure, and thank you. Yeah, sure, I can do all that. And
yeah.
I want to thank people for the people who like the Mars Trilogy. I mean, it is a 2,000-page novel. Many times I'm tempted to apologize. And one time I shouted to my television, why do all these people want to go to Mars? And my wife and my two boys just started laughing hilariously. I mean, what? So, okay, yeah. I might be semi-responsible. Although Mars has always been a magnet for the human mind. It's not me. It's Percival Lowell, and, you know, it's Ahura Mazda. Mars is a charismatic. For some reason, that book is a miniaturization. It's a modeling exercise. You think about, if only we could start history over, if only we could do things right, if only we actually knew that the planet we were on, we were making its ecology and its biosphere, if only. So there's an attraction to the Mars Trilogy for the way that it's a metaphor for what we're in right now. And I love that. And I have to say that the internet is mixed in its blessings as it is. The Mars Trilogy is selling better now than it did when it first came out. So this is like publishing anti-gravity, and I'm exceedingly grateful. My favorite characters, I like them all, but some seem more lively and more less like me. And those are the ones as a novelist I love the most. So I love Sax Russell, I love Maya Toitovna, and I like Nadia, and I like Anne Russell, and it goes on and on. Anne Claiborne, I mean. Anne Russell is a friend in Davis.
I'm sure you like her too.
I like her too. Sorry, okay, that's going to get a little punchy.
Yeah,
I liked them all. I like John Boone, and I like
Yeah.
Frank Chalmers. These were characters that it's like if you ask Calvin, does he like Hobbes or not? Well, yeah, he likes Hobbes.
Yeah.
I believe in them.
Yeah, fair enough. I think that I'm going to try and bring things to a close here by synthesizing a bunch of questions along the lines of altering an ecosystem always goes poorly. Have you not heard of the Holocene extinction that's already happening? It's too late to avoid an extinction event. I think maybe this goes to something like the themes of the last sort of section of your lecture, which is how on earth do we retain optimism?
Yeah, sure. This is a good question because it's true. Something like 2,000 species, we're already in an accelerated extinction event right now in the present. But my point is, it could get so much worse. And right now, we actually have a fair number of creatures still alive that if we don't do something differently, they won't. They're in a genetic bottleneck already, but they'll go extinct unless we act. So I'm going to say, yeah, we are in the start of an extinction event. It's a slippery slope. It's getting steep. We need to ratchet claw our way back off of it. And that is the distinction I would make for the person who's put in that very good question, or the people who put in that good question. It's already bad, the number of bird species that have gone extinct, and on like that. We all know this. But it could get so much worse that it boggles the imagination, and this is where maybe dystopia is useful, although they're never bad enough. In a dystopia, you're still eating food, and you're still fighting people with bows and arrows, and you bashing zombies in the head, and it's all okay, because the real dystopia would be worse. And that's why people love dystopias, is this kind of comfort food. You read a book where there's still a resistance, and oh gosh, it's worse for them than it is for me. You can feel good 2 or 3 ways by reading dystopia. But in fact, the real bad future, the bad Anthropocene, would be ever so much worse. So, okay, optimism, forget about it. Effectively, as bourgeois, middle-class American citizens, it doesn't matter how we feel about it. That feelings are a bourgeois luxury. You got to do it for survival, for the generations to come. You feel depressed one morning, you feel euphoric the next morning. So what? You're the only. There are 2 billion people on this planet who don't have the luxury of feeling feeling optimism or pessimism. So I would say use optimism, which I do, as a club to beat the crap out of the political system. I'm optimistic in the Gramsci sense of pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Just do what needs to be done and forget about your feelings.
I believe it was Nelson Mandela who said, optimism is rarely warranted but always necessary.
Yeah, well.
I would like, we've subjected Stan to an enormously long day, and so I'd like to ask your tolerance in 2 things. First of all, by allowing us to finish now, and secondly, not deluging him with requests for selfies and autographs on the way out, if only because he deserves a drink and dinner far more than anything else right now. So thank you very much.
Thank you.